The morning sun cast a golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Estates as Donald and Dorothy Barton stood in front of their new home, keys in hand, hearts full of promise. The two-story colonial house, with its classic red brick facade and crisp white trim, represented everything they had worked for over the past decade. At ages 35 and 33 respectively, Donald and Dorothy had spent years saving, planning, and dreaming of this moment. Now, standing in front of 1247 Maple Avenue, their dream had finally materialized. The neighborhood seemed pulled straight from a Norman Rockwell painting. Mature oak trees lined both sides of the street, their branches creating a natural canopy that dappled the sidewalks with shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow. Children's bicycles leaned against white picket fences, and the distant sound of a lawnmower hummed in harmony with chirping birds. It was early spring, and the air carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry blossoms from the trees that dotted the front yards along the street. Their children, Beverly and Ben, aged 8 and 6, couldn't contain their excitement as they raced up the concrete path leading to their new front door. Beverly, with her dark curls bouncing in the morning light, clutched her favorite stuffed elephant, a constant companion that had seen her through every major life change. Ben, smaller but equally energetic, followed close behind, his Lightning McQueen backpack nearly as big as he was, filled with his most precious possessions for the move. "Watch your step, kids," Dorothy called out, her voice carrying a mixture of maternal concern and barely contained joy. She squeezed Donald's hand, and he returned the gesture, both sharing a moment of silent triumph. They had viewed countless houses over the past year, each one falling short in some way: too small, too expensive, wrong neighborhood, poor school district. But this house, this neighborhood, felt different from the moment they first drove down Maple Avenue. The house itself was modest by some standards, but perfect for their needs. At 2,400 square feet, it offered plenty of room for their family to grow. The previous owners, an elderly couple who had lived there for 30 years, had maintained it meticulously. The red brick exterior was classic and timeless, with black shutters framing each window and white dental molding adding a touch of architectural elegance. A covered front porch, complete with enough space for a pair of rocking chairs, promised lazy Sunday afternoons watching the world go by. As Donald inserted the key into the lock for the first time as homeowners, he remembered the selling points that had sealed their decision. The kitchen had been recently updated with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, a must for Dorothy, who loved to cook and bake with the kids. The living room featured a wood-burning fireplace with an original marble mantel, something Donald had always wanted for cozy winter evenings. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms meant both kids could have their own spaces, with a guest room left over for visiting grandparents or a future home office. But it was the backyard that had truly captured their hearts. Nearly a quarter acre of level ground, fully fenced with mature privacy hedges along the borders. A concrete patio extended from the back of the house, perfect for summer barbecues and outdoor dining. The previous owners had maintained a small vegetable garden in one corner, which Dorothy immediately envisioned expanding. There was more than enough space for the swing set the kids had been begging for, and the large maple tree in the back corner seemed to be calling out for a treehouse, a project Donald had already started planning in his mind. The moving truck wouldn't arrive for another hour, so the family took the opportunity to explore their new home once again, this time as owners rather than prospective buyers. Their footsteps echoed through the empty rooms, mixing with the excited chatter of Beverly and Ben as they raced up and down the stairs, claiming bedrooms and planning where each piece of furniture would go. "Mom. Dad. Can I have the blue room?" Beverly called from upstairs, her voice bouncing off the bare walls. "The one with the window seat, and I want the one next to it," Ben chimed in, not to be outdone by his sister. "It has the best view of the street." Dorothy laughed, the sound filling the empty house with warmth. "Yes to both," she called back. "But remember, we agreed no painting until we've been here at least a month." The children's footsteps thundered overhead as they continued their exploration, their excitement palpable. In the kitchen, Donald wrapped his arms around Dorothy from behind as they gazed out the window at their new backyard. The morning sun highlighted the dewy grass, and a pair of cardinals hopped along the fence line, adding splashes of bright red to the verdant landscape. "Can you believe it's really ours?" Dorothy whispered, leaning back against him. "After all the searching, all the loan applications, all the negotiations." Donald kissed the top of her head, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo. "We did it, honey. We really did it." His voice caught slightly with emotion. "This is where our kids will grow up. Where they'll learn to ride bikes, where they'll have their first sleepovers, where they'll leave for their first dates." "Don't get ahead of yourself," Dorothy laughed, turning to face him. "Ben still thinks girls have cooties, and Beverly's only interested in her stuffed animals right now. Let's enjoy this moment." The sound of a car door closing outside drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they watched as their new next-door neighbors walked across their lawn, carrying what appeared to be a homemade casserole and a bottle of wine. "Looks like we're about to meet the neighbors," Donald said, straightening his shirt. The gesture made Dorothy smile, always the professional, even on moving day. His job as a software developer had made this move possible, and his attention to detail showed in everything he did. The doorbell chimed, its sound fresh and unfamiliar in their new home. As they walked to answer it, Beverly and Ben thundered down the stairs, curious about their first visitors. Opening the door, they were greeted by a middle-aged couple with warm smiles. "Welcome to Maple Avenue," the woman said brightly, holding out the casserole. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is my husband James. We live in the blue house next door." She nodded toward their home. "We thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal today." With all the moving chaos, the gesture touched Dorothy deeply. In their old neighborhood, they had barely known their neighbors' names. "That's so thoughtful," she said, accepting the dishes. "I'm Dorothy, this is my husband Donald, and these are our children, Beverly and Ben." The children, suddenly shy, half hid behind their parents, but James Mitchell knelt down to their level. "You know," he said conspiratorially, "we have grandkids about your age who visit every weekend. They love playing in our treehouse." Both children's eyes lit up at this revelation. As the adults chatted, learning about the neighborhood and community, Donald and Dorothy exchanged glances. This was exactly what they had hoped for, a friendly, welcoming community where their children could thrive. The Mitchells explained that the neighborhood was close-knit, with regular block parties in the summer and holiday celebrations in the winter. They mentioned the excellent school district, something Donald and Dorothy had researched extensively, in the community pool just 3 blocks away. There was a small shopping center within walking distance, and the public library hosted weekly story times for children. And of course, Sarah added, the HOA keeps everything looking nice and organized. Harold Cooper, the president, is very dedicated to maintaining standards. There was something in her tone that Donald couldn't quite read, but he dismissed it, too caught up in the joy of the moment to dwell on it. As the Mitchells said their goodbyes, promising to introduce them to more neighbors soon, Donald and Dorothy stood in their doorway, arms around each other, watching their children already planning their first visit to the Mitchells' treehouse. The moving truck appeared at the end of the street, and with it, the promise of a new chapter in their lives. The rest of the day passed in a blur of moving boxes, furniture arrangement, and pizza delivery for dinner. By sunset, though only half their belongings were unpacked, the house was already beginning to feel like home. Beverly and Ben had fallen asleep in their new rooms, surrounded by boxes but content in their new spaces. Donald and Dorothy sat on their front porch steps, sharing the bottle of wine the Mitchells had brought, watching the street lights flicker on one by one. The evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the sounds of crickets and distant children playing their last games before bedtime. "We made the right choice," Dorothy said softly, resting her head on Donald's shoulder. "This is exactly where we're meant to be," Donald nodded, taking in the peaceful scene before them. The street was quiet now, the houses along it glowing warmly from within. In one window, he could see a family gathering around their dinner table. In another, someone was reading in a comfortable chair. Each home held its own stories, its own dreams, and now their home would hold theirs. Little did they know that their dream home would soon become the backdrop for a nightmare they could never have imagined. But for now, in this perfect moment, they were simply a family beginning their new life in their perfect home, full of hope and dreams for the future. The second day in their new home dawned bright and promising. Donald had taken the week off work to help with the move, and the morning found the family settling into what would become their new routine. Dorothy was in the kitchen, unpacking boxes of dishes and arranging them in the cabinets while simultaneously directing Beverly and Ben in organizing their toys in the family room. The sounds of cardboard boxes being dragged across hardwood floors and children's laughter filled the house with life. Donald stood in the garage, surrounded by towers of moving boxes, methodically organizing tools and equipment. The morning sun streamed through the open garage door, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He had just finished hanging a pegboard for his tools when the distinct sound of measured footsteps on the driveway caught his attention. Looking up, he saw a figure approaching with purposeful strides. Harold Cooper cut an imposing figure despite his average height. In his late 50s, with steel gray hair precisely combed and a physique that suggested regular gym visits, he carried himself with the air of someone accustomed to authority. His polo shirt was crisp and tucked into pressed khakis, a clipboard clutched in one hand with the gravitational certainty of a judge's gavel. Even from a distance, Donald could see the way Cooper's eyes methodically scanned every detail of their property, like a general surveying a battlefield. "Good afternoon," Cooper announced, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered the same greeting countless times. He didn't wait for Donald to respond before continuing. "I'm Harold Cooper, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." The way he emphasized his title made it clear this wasn't merely an introduction, it was a declaration of authority. Donald wiped his hands on a nearby rag and stepped forward to offer a handshake. "Donald Barton. Nice to meet you." Cooper's grip was firm to the point of discomfort, his handshake lasting a fraction too long to be purely cordial. "I always make it a point to personally welcome new residents," Cooper continued, though his tone carried no actual warmth. "And more importantly, to ensure they receive and understand our community guidelines." He held up a thick booklet that had been tucked under his clipboard. The cover read Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Community Guidelines and Regulations in bold, authoritative letters. The booklet was at least an inch thick, bound in a dark blue cover that reminded Donald uncomfortably of legal documents. Cooper held it out with the ceremonial gravity of a priest presenting sacred texts. "I recommend reading this thoroughly," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We take our guidelines very seriously here in Oak Ridge Estates. It's what keeps our property values high and our community orderly." As Donald accepted the booklet, Cooper's attention shifted to the garage interior. His eyes lingered on the boxes, the newly hung pegboard, and particularly on Donald's collection of power tools spread out on a workbench. "I see you're planning some projects," he observed, his tone carrying a hint of something that made Donald's skin prickle. "You'll find all the relevant restrictions regarding home improvements in Section 4. Any external modifications require prior board approval, of course." Before Donald could respond, Beverly and Ben came running out of the house, their footsteps thundering across the driveway. Dad. Mom says lunches." They stopped short at the sight of Cooper, whose presence seemed to cast a sudden chill over the sunny afternoon. Cooper's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he regarded the children. "Ah, yes. Section 7.3 covers noise regulations and quiet hours. Children can be energetic. It's important to ensure they understand the community standards." The words were delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. Dorothy appeared in the garage doorway, likely drawn by the sudden silence from the children. She wore an apron dusted with flour, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. "Donald. Is everything?" she trailed off, taking in the scene before her. "Mrs. Barton, I presume." Cooper turned to face her, his clipboard shifting to his other hand. "I was just explaining to your husband the importance of our community guidelines. We've had issues with previous residents who failed to take them seriously. I trust that won't be the case with your family." Dorothy moved to stand beside Donald, her hand finding his arm in what might have looked like a casual gesture but felt more like an instinctive response to Cooper's presence. "Of course not," she replied, her voice maintaining a politeness that Donald knew masked uncertainty. "We're very happy to be part of the community." Cooper nodded, though his expression suggested he was reserving judgment. "Yes, well, happiness is secondary to compliance." You'll find all the necessary forms for any future requests in the appendix of the guidebook. All modifications, no matter how minor, must be submitted in triplicate with the appropriate filing fees. He paused, consulting his clipboard with an air of bureaucratic authority. I've already noted several items that will need attention. Your garbage bins are visible from the street. They must be stored out of sight at all times except during designated collection hours. The welcome mat at your front door exceeds the maximum dimensions outlined in section 2.4. And I noticed one of your shutters appears to be approximately 2 degrees off true vertical. Donald felt his jaw tighten but maintained his composure. We've only been here a day, Mr. Cooper. We're still getting settled. The guidelines don't have a grace period, Mr. Barton, Cooper replied sharply. They're in effect from the moment of ownership transfer. I'll give you 48 hours to address these initial violations, but I expect full compliance moving forward. He made a show of checking his watch, an expensive looking timepiece that gleamed in the sunlight. I suggest you start with the guidebook. It's illuminating reading. As Cooper turned to leave, his shoes crunching precisely on the concrete, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. Oh, and Mr. Barton. That pickup truck in your driveway, recreational vehicles and work vehicles must be garage kept or stored off-site. Section 5.2. With that, he strode away, his clipboard swinging like a pendulum at his side. The family stood in silence for a moment, watching Cooper's retreating figure. Beverly tugged at Dorothy's apron. Mom, who was that man? He seemed scary. Dorothy knelt down to her daughter's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He's just someone who helps run the neighborhood, sweetie. Nothing to be scared of. But as she met Donald's eyes over their daughter's head, they shared a look of unease. Donald hefted the guidebook in his hands, feeling its weight like a portent. Inside the garage, the carefully organized tools suddenly seemed like potential violations waiting to be discovered. The sunny afternoon had taken on a different quality, as if Cooper's visit had cast a shadow that the sun couldn't quite dispel. That evening, after the children were in bed, Donald and Dorothy sat at the kitchen table, the guidebook open between them like a decoded warning. Page after page of regulations, restrictions, and requirements filled the volume, each section more detailed and constraining than the last. Paint colors had to be chosen from an approved palette of 37 specific shades. Holiday decorations could only be displayed during strictly defined date ranges. Even the species of plants allowed in the garden were catalogued with scientific precision. This is intense, Dorothy said, flipping through the pages. Listen to this. Bird feeders must be mounted at a height of exactly 5 feet 7 from ground level and may only contain approved seed mixtures as outlined in Appendix C. Who measures these things? Harold Cooper. Apparently, Donald replied, running a hand through his hair. Did you notice how he was looking at everything? Like he was making a mental inventory of potential violations. Dorothy closed the book, her fingers tracing the embossed letters on the cover. Sarah Mitchell tried to warn us, didn't she? Yesterday, when she mentioned Cooper being dedicated to maintaining standards, there was something in her tone. We can handle this, Donald assured her, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. We'll review the guidelines, make any necessary adjustments. It's just a matter of following the rules, right? But as they prepared for bed that night, both knew that Cooper's visit had been more than just a routine welcome. It was a warning, a declaration of authority, and perhaps most disturbingly, a preview of things to come. The dream home they had fallen in love with suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a carefully regulated territory where every decision, every modification, every aspect of their daily lives would be subject to scrutiny. Donald stood at their bedroom window, looking out over the dock and street. The houses all looked perfect, their lawns precisely maintained, their exteriors conforming to approved color schemes. Even in the darkness, there was a geometric precision to everything that he hadn't noticed before. In the distance, he could see a figure moving along the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, and knew without doubt that it was Cooper, conducting his nightly patrol of his domain. The guidebook sat on their bedside table, its presence as commanding as Cooper's voice had been. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of ensuring compliance, of measuring and adjusting and conforming. But as Donald climbed into bed beside Dorothy, He couldn't shake the feeling that they had unknowingly stepped into something far more complex than a simple set of community guidelines. "We'll be fine," Dorothy whispered in the darkness, perhaps sensing his unease. "It's just a matter of following the rules." Donald pulled her close, trying to find comfort in her optimism. But Cooper's words echoed in his mind. Happiness is secondary to compliance. Something in those words, in the way they had been delivered, suggested that following the rules might not be as straightforward as they hoped. The dream home they had chosen was now bound by regulations they hadn't fully understood, and their new life would be watched over by a man who seemed to take more pleasure in finding violations than in welcoming new neighbors. As they drifted off to sleep, the sound of measured footsteps on the sidewalk outside marked Cooper's passing, a reminder that in Oak Ridge Estates, someone was always watching, always measuring, always ready to point out when something or someone didn't quite measure up to the exacting standards of their perfect community. The first violation notice arrived exactly 1 week after they moved in. Donald found it in their mailbox, an official-looking envelope with the HOA logo embossed in dark blue. The paper inside was heavy, premium stock, the kind used for legal documents and wedding invitations. The contrast between the letter's refined appearance and its hostile content wasn't lost on him. Notice of violation, Section 3. 51 Waste management containers. The letter detailed, with photographs attached, how their trash cans had been visible from the street for approximately 18 hours after collection. According to the guidelines, containers were to be removed from site within 4 hours of pickup. The fine was $50. With an additional $25 per day until the violation was corrected. Donald stared at the notice, his coffee growing cold in his hand as he stood in the kitchen. They had been busy unpacking, organizing their new life, and yes, the trash cans had stayed out longer than they should have. But this level of documentation, the clinical precision of the complaint, felt excessive. "Another one?" Dorothy asked, coming up behind him. She didn't need to see his nod to know the answer. The slight tension in his shoulders told her everything. "Trash cans this time," he said, handing her the notice. "Apparently, we're supposed to teleport them into the garage the moment the garbage truck leaves." Dorothy skimmed the document, her expression darkening as she reached the fine amount. $50? For trash cans? That's ridiculous. She set the notice down on the counter with more force than necessary. "And these pictures, has he been monitoring our house?" The thought hung in the air between them, uncomfortable and impossible to dismiss. The photographs were time-stamped, showing their trash cans at various points throughout the day. Someone Cooper had made multiple passes by their house, documenting what most would consider a minor oversight. But this was just the beginning. 3 days later, another notice arrived. This time, it was about their lawn. According to Section 4.12 of the guidelines, grass height was not to exceed 3.5 inches. Their lawn, according to the meticulously documented measurements included in the notice, had reached 3.75 inches in several areas. Another $50 fine. Donald measured the grass himself after receiving the notice, using a ruler while their neighbors watched from behind their curtains. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him, a grown man on his hands and knees, measuring individual blades of grass. But the alternative was another fine, and they had already spent enough on Cooper's petty violations. The third notice came before they had even paid the first two. This one targeted the temporary basketball hoop Donald had set up for Ben in the driveway. Section 6.8 prohibited recreational equipment visible from the street, claiming it decreased property values and created an unsightly aesthetic. Ben's face when Donald had to take down the hoop haunted him. "But why, Dad? We're not doing anything wrong. We're just playing basketball." Donald had tried to explain about rules and community standards, but how do you explain arbitrary restrictions to a 6-year-old? How do you justify taking away something that brings joy simply because it doesn't fit someone else's vision of perfection? The notices kept coming, each more nitpicky than the last. Their welcome mat was 2 inches too wide. The roses Dorothy had planted weren't from the approved floral list. The wind chimes on their porch exceeded the maximum allowable decibel level. Yes, Cooper had actually brought a decibel meter to measure them. It wasn't just the violations themselves that wore them down, it was the constant surveillance. Cooper seemed to be everywhere, always watching, always documenting. They would catch glimpses of him walking past their house multiple times a day, clipboard in hand, camera ready to document any infractions. One Saturday morning, as Donald worked in the garage, he heard the now familiar sound of Cooper's measured footsteps on the driveway. He didn't need to look up to know what was coming. "Emma Barton," Cooper began, his voice carrying that same artificial politeness that had become all too familiar. "I noticed some concerning cracks in your driveway. Section 5.4 requires all hardscaping to be maintained in pristine condition." Donald straightened up slowly, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The cracks in question were barely visible, natural settling that occurred in any concrete over time. "Harold," he said, trying to keep his voice level, "those cracks are cosmetic at best. They're not a hazard." Cooper's smile was thin and cold. "The guidelines don't distinguish between cosmetic and structural issues, Mr. Barton. Any imperfection reflects poorly on the community as a whole. You'll need to have the entire driveway resurfaced within 30 days. "That's thousands of dollars," Donald protested. "We just moved in. We're still unpacking, for God's sake." "Perhaps," Cooper replied, raising an eyebrow, "you should have considered the financial responsibilities of home ownership in a premium community before purchasing here." He made a show of writing something on his clipboard. 30 days, Mr. Barton. After that, it's $100 per day until the issue is resolved." As Cooper walked away, Donald fought the urge to throw something at his retreating figure. Instead, he went inside and found Dorothy in the kitchen, tears in her eyes as she read yet another violation notice. "The children's chalk drawings on the driveway," she said, her voice shaking. "He's fining us for chalk drawings. They were playing hopscotch, Donald." Hopscotch. The harassment wasn't limited to official notices. Cooper had begun spreading rumors among the neighbors. Dorothy overheard him at the community pool, speaking just loudly enough to be heard, about how some people didn't understand the standards of the community. How certain elements were bringing down property values with their lack of respect for guidelines. The other neighbors were sympathetic, but only in whispers. Sarah Mitchell brought over cookies one afternoon and admitted that Cooper had driven out 3 families in the past year alone. "He finds something about you he doesn't like," she explained, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "and he makes your life miserable until you leave. It's easier than trying to formally evict someone." The constant stress began to take its toll. Beverly and Ben stopped playing outside as much, afraid that Mr. Cooper would document some new violation. Dorothy's garden, once a source of joy, became a source of anxiety as she obsessively checked and rechecked the approved plant list. Donald found himself losing sleep, lying awake at night listening for footsteps on the sidewalk. The breaking point came when Donald received a fine for parking his pickup truck in the driveway overnight. The letter claimed it violated Section 5.2, which prohibited commercial vehicles from being visible from the street. The truck was Donald's personal vehicle, used for weekend DIY projects and family camping trips. It wasn't commercial in any sense of the word. When Donald tried to appeal the fine, Cooper's response was immediate and harsh. "The definition of commercial vehicle is at the board's discretion," he said during a particularly tense phone call. "And as board president, I'm determining that your truck qualifies. Either garage it, remove it, or pay the fines." That evening, Donald and Dorothy sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by violation notices and fine statements. The total had reached over $1,000, and more notices arrived almost daily. Their dream home had become a source of constant stress and financial drain. "We can't keep living like this," Dorothy said quietly, running her fingers over yet another notice. "The kids are afraid to play outside. I jump every time I hear footsteps on the sidewalk. This isn't the life we wanted for our family." Donald reached across the table and took her hand. "We're not going to let him win," he said firmly. "This is our home. We followed every reasonable rule, kept the property in perfect condition. He's not targeting us because we're bad neighbors. He's targeting us because he can." The realization that Cooper's harassment wasn't about maintaining community standards, it was about power, changed something in Donald. The next day, he began documenting everything. He installed security cameras to record Cooper's frequent passes by their house. He started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, every violation notice, every conversation with neighbors about similar experiences. As he reviewed the evidence he was gathering, a pattern emerged. Cooper's harassment wasn't random, it was calculated, escalating, designed to break them down gradually. But understanding the pattern didn't make it easier to bear. Each day brought new violations, new fines, new forms of harassment. Their home, once a symbol of achievement and happiness, had become a battlefield. Every morning brought the anxiety of checking the mailbox, every evening the stress of wondering what new violation Cooper would invent. The children's laughter, once a common sound in their yard, had been replaced by the quiet rustle of papers as Donald and Dorothy documented yet another instance of harassment. But through it all, they refused to break. They paid the fines they couldn't fight, documented the ones they could, and tried to maintain some semblance of normal life for their children. They didn't know it yet, but Cooper's campaign of harassment was about to enter a new, more dangerous phase, one that would test their resilience in ways they never could have imagined. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Clubhouse stood as a monument to suburban affluence, its brick facade and white columns attempting to evoke a sense of governmental authority. On the evening of the monthly HOA meeting, Donald pulled into the parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly enough to leave marks. The manila folder on the passenger seat contained weeks of documented violations, photographs, and a carefully prepared statement. After months of harassment, he was finally ready to confront Cooper publicly. The setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn as residents filed into the building. Donald noticed how they moved in small groups, speaking in hushed tones that fell silent whenever Cooper's associates passed nearby. The atmosphere reminded him of a courtroom before a controversial trial, thick with tension and unspoken alliances. Inside, the meeting room was arranged like a small parliament. A long, curved table at the front held places for the HOA board members, with Cooper's seat slightly elevated in the center, a detail Donald was certain hadn't happened by accident. Rows of chairs faced the table, already filling with residents who seemed to instinctively choose sides. Cooper's supporters on the left, those sympathetic to various homeowner complaints on the right, and a nervous middle section of those trying to remain neutral. Sarah Mitchell caught Donald's eye as he entered, giving him a subtle nod of encouragement. She had called him earlier that day, her voice tight with concern. "Be careful, Donald," she had warned. "Cooper doesn't just run meetings, he orchestrates them. Every question, every response, it's all choreographed to maintain his control." Donald took a seat in the second row, directly in Cooper's line of sight. He wanted the HOA president to see him, to know that he wasn't afraid anymore. As he arranged his documents, he recalled Dorothy's words from that morning. "Make him understand we won't be bullied, but don't let him provoke you into losing your temper." That's what he wants. At exactly 7 p.m., Cooper entered through a side door, followed by the other board members in what seemed like a practiced procession. The room fell silent as Cooper took his seat, adjusting his microphone with the deliberate movements of someone who understood the power of making others wait. "I call this meeting of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association to order," Cooper announced, his voice carrying the same artificial warmth he used during his property inspections. "We'll begin with the treasurer's report, followed by old business, new business, and then open comments from residents." Donald sat through an hour of mundane discussions about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. He noticed how Cooper controlled every aspect of the conversation, steering discussions away from anything that might challenge his authority. When homeowners raised concerns about recent fee increases, Cooper dismissed them with references to maintaining community standards and property value protection. Finally, the meeting reached the open comments section. Cooper's eyes swept the room, lingering for a moment on Donald before moving on. "We'll now hear from residents who signed up to speak. Please remember the 3-minute time limit." The first two speakers presented exactly the kind of trivial concerns Cooper preferred: a request for additional flower beds near the community entrance, a complaint about newspaper delivery times. Donald watched as Cooper handled each with practiced efficiency, giving the appearance of attention while actually dismissing their concerns. "Next speaker, Donald Barton," Cooper announced, his tone carrying a slight edge that hadn't been present for the previous speakers. Donald stood, gathering his documents. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as he approached the podium. He could feel Cooper's eyes on him, cold and calculating, already preparing counter moves to whatever Donald might say. Mr. Cooper, board members, neighbors, Donald began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I'm here tonight to address what I believe is a serious abuse of power within our community. He pulled out the first document from his folder, a timeline of harassment that spread across multiple pages. Over the past 3 months, my family has received 37 violation notices, totaling over $3,000 in fines. These violations range from the trivial to the absurd. Donald began laying out photographs on the podium. Our trash cans being visible for a few hours after collection. Grass that was a 1/4 inch too tall. Children's chalk drawings on our own driveway. Cooper's face remained impassive, but Donald noticed his fingers tightening around his pen. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Donald continued. But it's not just the violations themselves, it's the pattern of targeted harassment they represent. Donald turned to address the room directly. Mr. Cooper has photographed our property multiple times daily. He's spread rumors about our family at community events. He's even measured the decibel level of our wind chimes. A murmur ran through the audience. Donald saw several heads nodding, while others looked down, perhaps recognizing similar experiences of their own. The HOA guidelines were created to maintain community standards, not as a weapon for personal vendettas. Donald continued. I've spoken with other residents who faced similar targeting. 3 families have been driven out of Oak Ridge Estates in the past year alone due to this kind of harassment. Cooper's facade of politeness finally cracked. Mr. Barton, he interrupted, his voice sharp. You're making serious accusations without evidence. If you're unhappy with the enforcement of our guidelines, perhaps this isn't the right community for you. Donald held up his folder. I have evidence of every claim I'm making. Time-stamped photographs of your multiple daily inspections. Documentation of selective enforcement. Statements from former residents about their experiences. Your time is up, Mr. Barton, Cooper announced, reaching for his gavel. I'm not finished, Donald replied firmly. The community needs to understand what's happening here. This isn't about maintaining standards, it's about control. It's about using these guidelines as a tool for personal power. Cooper's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This meeting is not a forum for personal attacks. If you have complaints about violations, there's a proper procedure for appeals. The appeals that you personally oversee, Donald challenged. The same appeals that have been denied for every homeowner who's dared to question your authority. The room had grown tense, the air electric with unspoken confrontation. Some residents were nodding more vigorously now, while others looked between Donald and Cooper like spectators at a tennis match. This meeting is adjourned, Cooper declared suddenly, bringing down his gavel with enough force to make the microphone jump. Of course it is, Donald said, his voice carrying clearly despite the sudden commotion. Because that's what you do, isn't it, Mr. Cooper? When someone challenges your authority, you shut down the conversation. When someone questions your methods, you threaten them with more violations. When someone stands up to you, you try to drive them out of the community. Cooper stood, his chair scraping back with the harsh sound. If you have further complaints, Mr. Barton, you can take them up with the HOA's attorney. This meeting is over. As the room began to empty, several residents approached Donald quietly, speaking in hurried whispers. We've been dealing with the same thing, one woman confided, glancing nervously over her shoulder. He targeted us last year when we painted our shutters the wrong shade of brown. He's been doing this for years, another resident added. But nobody's had the courage to stand up to him like this. Sarah Mitchell touched Donald's arm as she passed. Be careful, she warned again. He won't take this challenge to his authority lightly. Donald gathered his documents, watching as Cooper huddled with his board members in the corner, their heads close together in intense discussion. He had known this confrontation wouldn't solve everything, but he had hoped it might at least bring the issues into the open. As he walked to his car in the darkening evening, Donald's phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. How did it go? He stared at the screen for a moment, considering his response. Finally, he typed, I said what needed to be said. But I think this is just the beginning. Looking back at the clubhouse, Donald could see Cooper still inside, illuminated by the interior lights, watching him through the window. The Hoa president's expression was unreadable at this distance, but his posture conveyed a clear message. This wasn't over. Donald drove home slowly, his mind replaying the confrontation. He had achieved his goal of bringing Cooper's behavior into the open, but at what cost? The support from other residents had been encouraging, but would it translate into actual change, or would they retreat into fearful compliance once Cooper began his inevitable retaliation? As he pulled into his driveway, Donald noticed a white envelope tucked under his windshield wiper, a fresh violation notice, probably placed there while he was at the meeting. The message was clear. Cooper wasn't going to back down. If anything, the public confrontation had just raised the stakes in their ongoing conflict. Donald removed the envelope but didn't open it. Tomorrow would bring new violations, new challenges, new forms of harassment. But something had changed tonight. The facade of proper procedure and community standards had cracked, revealing the true nature of Cooper's regime. The question now was not if there would be consequences, but how severe they would be. Looking at his home, with its warmly lit windows and the shadows of his family moving inside, Donald felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. He had taken a stand, given voice to what many in the community had been afraid to say. But he also knew that Cooper would make him pay for that courage, and the true test of his resolve was yet to come. The night air hung heavy with an unusual stillness, broken only by the gentle hum of the dishwasher and the distant sound of crickets. Donald sat in his home office, the blue light from his laptop casting shadows across stacks of Hoa documents and violation notices. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation at the community meeting, and Cooper's retaliation had been swift and methodical. The violation notices had doubled, each more absurd than the last, but something about Cooper's behavior had changed. There was an intensity to his surveillance now, a barely contained fury that made Donald increasingly uneasy. Dorothy was in the living room, trying to distract herself with a magazine but unable to fully concentrate. The children had been put to bed an hour ago, their usual bedtime routine now including a careful check of all windows and doors, a new habit born of growing anxiety. The security system Donald had installed the previous weekend blinked steadily, its green light a constant reminder of their changing reality. It was just past 10:30 p.m. when Donald noticed movement on one of the security camera feeds displayed on his phone. The backyard floodlight had activated, its motion sensor triggered by something or someone moving along the fence line. At first, he dismissed it as probably a cat or raccoon, but then he saw it. A familiar figure moving with deliberate purpose, flashlight beam sweeping across their property. Dorothy, Donald called softly, his voice carrying an urgency that brought her immediately to his side. Cooper is in our backyard. She leaned over his shoulder, watching the security feed with widening eyes. What is he doing? It's the middle of the night on the screen. Cooper moved with the confidence of someone who believed they had every right to be there. His flashlight beam lingered on different areas of their property, the children's swing set, Dorothy's garden, the recently installed security cameras. Even through the grainy night vision footage, they could see the clipboard in his free hand, his eternal weapon of documentation. I'm going out there, Donald said, rising from his chair. Dorothy grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. Be careful, she whispered. He's not rational anymore. Not since the meeting. Donald nodded, slipping his phone into his pocket with the camera feed still active. The walk to the back door felt longer than usual, each step measured and deliberate. Through the glass panels, he could see Cooper's flashlight beam dancing across their yard, creating eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Opening the door, Donald stepped onto the patio. The motion-activated light illuminated the entire yard now, catching Cooper in its harsh glare. Hey, Donald called out, his voice carrying through the quiet neighborhood. What the hell are you doing on my property? Cooper turned slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping up to shine directly in Donald's face. Rather than showing surprise or embarrassment at being caught, Cooper's expression held something closer to satisfaction, as if this confrontation was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Just checking for violations, Mr. Barton, Cooper called back, his voice carrying that familiar tone of bureaucratic authority, now tinged with something darker. Homeowners Association business. At 10:30 at night. Donald took a step forward, anger rising in his chest. This is private property, Cooper. You're trespassing. Cooper's laugh was short and cold. Trespassing? You should read the guidelines more carefully, Barton. Section 8.3 gives the board authority to inspect properties for violations at any time. Any time, he emphasized the last words, swinging his flashlight beam across the yard again. That's not how this works, Donald said, his voice firm. You need permission to enter private property. Get out of my yard, Cooper. Now, instead of leaving, Cooper took several steps closer, his shoes crunching on the gravel path Dorothy had recently installed without her approval, as he had repeatedly pointed out. You think you're above the rules, don't you, Barton? You and your family, with your unauthorized landscaping and your security cameras and your little speech at the meeting. The mention of the meeting carried a weight of menace that made Donald's skin crawl. He was suddenly very aware of Dorothy watching from the house, probably already on the phone with the police. This is your last warning, Donald said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Leave my property now, or I'm calling the police. Cooper took another step forward, close enough now that Donald could see the gleam in his eyes. The police. He smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. And what will you tell them? That the Hoa president was performing his duties? That I was ensuring compliance with community standards? I'll tell them that a man is trespassing on my property in the middle of the night, harassing my family. Donald pulled out his phone, making sure Cooper could see him starting to dial. Your badge as Hoa president doesn't give you the right to break the law. Cooper's demeanor shifted suddenly, the bureaucratic mask slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. You made a mistake, Barton. That little display at the meeting? Trying to turn the community against me? That was a serious mistake. The only mistake, Donald replied, was thinking you had any real authority beyond what the homeowners grant you. Now get off my property. For a moment, Cooper didn't move. He stood there, flashlight beam still aimed at Donald's face, his clipboard held like a shield. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. You know, he said, his voice almost conversational, it's interesting how many violations one can find during a night inspection. The angle of your security lights, for instance, definitely exceeds the maximum allowable lumens. And that garden bed, he gestured with his flashlight. At least 3 inches beyond the approved dimensions. Each violation carries a separate fine, of course. Document whatever you want, Donald said. But do it from public property. You're not welcome here. Cooper's smile widened, showing teeth. Not welcome? This is my community, Barton. I built it. I maintained it. I protected it from people like you who think the rules don't apply to them. He took a step back, but his expression remained threatening. Consider this a reminder of how things work in Oak Ridge Estates. The rules aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're law. My law. With that, he turned and walked toward the gate, his movements unhurried, confident. At the gate, he paused and looked back. Oh, and Barton? Tell your wife her roses are still 3 inches too close to the property line. That'll be another violation notice in tomorrow's mail. Donald watched him exit through the gate, making sure it latched behind him before heading back inside. Dorothy was waiting by the door, her face pale in the security light's glow. I called the police, she said quietly. They're sending someone. Donald nodded, pulling her close. Through the window, they could see Cooper walking down the sidewalk, his flashlight beam swinging methodically from side to side, checking for violations even now. But something had changed tonight. The pretense of proper procedures and community standards had been stripped away, revealing the true nature of their conflict with Cooper. Later, after giving their statement to a sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful police officer, Donald and Dorothy lay awake in bed, listening to the sounds of their home. Every creak, Every settling noise carried new weight now. The security system's steady green light seemed less reassuring than before. He's not going to stop, is he? Dorothy whispered into the darkness. Donald pulled her closer, but didn't immediately answer. He was thinking about Cooper's eyes in the security light, about the barely contained rage he'd seen there. No, Cooper wasn't going to stop. Tonight's intrusion wasn't just about looking for violations, it was a message, a demonstration of power, a warning of things to come. "We'll handle this," Donald finally said, but even as the words left his mouth, he wondered exactly how they would. Cooper had crossed a line tonight, moving from bureaucratic harassment to physical intimidation. The rules of engagement had changed, and Donald knew their next steps would have to be chosen very carefully. Outside, the motion sensor light clicked on again, making them both tense. It was just a cat this time, crossing their yard in the night. But the moment of fear it induced was real, and Donald knew it would be the first of many such moments. Cooper had succeeded in making them feel unsafe in their own home, and that was probably exactly what he had intended. As they finally drifted off to sleep, Donald's last thoughts were of Cooper's words, "This is my community." The statement revealed everything about how Cooper viewed his role not as a servant of the community, but as its owner, its ruler, its dictator. And like all dictators, he saw any challenge to his authority as a threat that had to be eliminated. The night intrusion marked a turning point in their conflict with Cooper. What had started as a battle over community guidelines had evolved into something more sinister, more personal. The question was no longer about trash cans or garden dimensions, it was about power, control, and the lengths one man would go to maintain his grip on both. The Millbrook Police Department's lobby was quiet that morning, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the institutional green walls. Donald sat in one of the hard plastic chairs, a thick folder of documentation on his lap, waiting to speak with an officer. He had arrived as soon as the station opened, determined to take formal action after Cooper's nighttime intrusion. Officer Sarah Martinez called him back to her desk at 8:15 a.m. She was a veteran officer with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor that Donald immediately appreciated. The nameplate on her desk was well worn, suggesting years of service listening to community complaints and concerns. "So, Mr. Barton," she began, opening a fresh incident report on her computer, "tell me what brings you in today." Donald placed his folder on her desk, carefully opening it to reveal meticulously organized documentation. "I need to file a report about ongoing harassment and trespassing by our HOA president, Harold Cooper." He pulled out the security camera footage from the previous night, stored on a USB drive. "Last night, he entered our property without permission at 10:30 p.m., refused to leave when confronted, and made what I consider to be threatening statements." Officer Martinez's fingers paused over her keyboard. "Was this the first incident?" "No," Donald replied, pulling out a timeline he had prepared. "It's been escalating over the past few months. Started with excessive violation notices and fines, progressed to constant surveillance, and now this." He spread out photographs showing Cooper's multiple daily passes by their house, documentation of the violation notices, and statements he'd collected from neighbors about similar experiences. The officer reviewed the materials carefully, her expression growing more serious as she went through each piece of evidence. "You've been very thorough in documenting everything," she noted, examining the timestamps on the photos. "I had to be," Donald explained. "Cooper is methodical. He documents everything himself, uses it as ammunition. I needed to create our own record of what's really happening." Officer Martinez nodded, turning to her computer to input information. "The challenge here," she said carefully, "is that many of these incidents fall into a gray area legally. HOA presidents do have certain rights to inspect properties, even if the way Mr. Cooper is exercising those rights seems excessive, but surely trespassing at night is crossing a line." Donald leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "The nighttime incident is definitely concerning," she agreed, reviewing the security footage again. "However, without evidence of direct threats or property damage, it's unlikely the DA would pursue criminal charges. What we can do is issue a formal warning about trespassing and document everything in case the situation escalates further." Donald felt a familiar weight settling in his chest, the same feeling he'd had every time Cooper had hidden behind HOA regulations to justify his harassment. "So there's nothing you can do?" Officer Martinez's expression softened slightly. "I didn't say that. We can take several steps to protect you and your family." She pulled out a form and began writing. "First, I'm documenting everything you've provided. This creates an official record of Cooper's behavior. Second, I'm issuing a formal warning about trespassing if he enters your property again without permission, especially at night. Call us immediately." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I'm also going to recommend increasing your security measures. The cameras you've installed are good, but consider adding more coverage, particularly around entry points. Document everything, every interaction, every violation notice, every incident. If this continues to escalate, having a clear pattern of behavior documented will be crucial." Donald nodded, pulling out his notebook to write down her suggestions. "We've already installed additional security lights and cameras after last night. The kids are scared. They don't understand why the mean man keeps coming to our house." The mention of his children seemed to strike a chord with Officer Martinez. She leaned forward, her voice taking on an added note of seriousness. "Mr. Barton, while we may be limited in what we can do legally right now, I want you to understand something. If at any point you or your family feels physically threatened, don't hesitate to call 911. Cooper's position as HOA president doesn't give him the right to make you feel unsafe in your own home." She began typing again, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "I'm entering a flag in our system about your address. Any calls from your property will be treated as priority, given the history we're documenting today. I'm also noting Cooper's name and vehicle description. That way, if our officers see him in your area during unusual hours, they'll know to pay extra attention." Donald felt a slight relief at these concrete steps, even if they weren't as definitive as he'd hoped. "What about the other families?" he asked. "We're not the first ones he's targeted like this." Officer Martinez looked up from her computer. "Have any of them filed reports?" "No," Donald admitted. "They were too afraid of retaliation. Cooper has a way of making life impossible for anyone who challenges him. That's unfortunately common in these situations," she said, her tone suggesting she'd seen similar cases before. "People in positions of authority, even relatively minor ones like HOA president, can abuse that power in ways that are hard to address legally. It often falls into a gray area between civil and criminal matters." She pulled out several more forms, explaining each one as she filled them out. "I'm giving you copies of everything we've discussed today. Keep them somewhere safe, preferably not in your house. Start a journal documenting every interaction with Cooper, no matter how minor it seems. Times, dates, witnesses, what was said, everything." Donald gathered the forms, adding them to his folder. "And the security measures? Any specific recommendations?" Officer Martinez reached for a pamphlet on her desk. "Our Community Safety Division can do a free security assessment of your property. They'll check your locks, lighting, camera placement, and make recommendations for improvements." She handed him the pamphlet along with her business card. "I'm writing my direct line on here. If anything happens, anything that makes you feel threatened, call me immediately." As Donald stood to leave, Officer Martinez added one final thought. "Mr. Barton, people like Cooper, they count on others feeling powerless. They use rules and regulations as weapons, thinking it puts them above the law. But the law exists to protect people, not property values. Don't let him make you feel powerless in your own home." Walking back to his car, Donald felt a mix of emotions. The police response hadn't been everything he'd hoped for, but it was a start. They had an official record now, documentation that could prove crucial if things continued to escalate. And Officer Martinez's words about not feeling powerless had struck home. In his car, he began making notes about additional security measures. The security company would be coming later that day to install more cameras and motion sensors. He'd also contacted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, though getting an appointment was proving difficult. Apparently, such cases were increasingly common. His phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. "How did it go?" Donald stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "They're documenting everything. Can't do much legally yet, but we have support if things get worse. Meeting security company at 2 p.m. As he drove home, Donald noticed Cooper's car parked near the entrance to their subdivision. The Hoa president was standing beside it, clipboard in hand, watching as Donald's car approached. Their eyes met briefly as Donald passed, and Cooper's expression was one of smug confidence, the look of someone who believed themselves untouchable. But something had changed. By going to the police, by officially documenting everything, Donald had taken away some of Cooper's power. The Hoa president's actions were no longer just neighborhood politics, they were now part of an official record, subject to real scrutiny if things escalated further. Pulling into his driveway, Donald saw Beverly and Ben playing in the front yard under Dorothy's watchful eye. They had been reluctant to play outside since Cooper's nighttime visit, but Dorothy had insisted on maintaining some normalcy in their lives. Watching them now, their laughter carrying across the lawn, Donald felt his resolve strengthen. They might not be able to stop Cooper immediately, but they could protect themselves, document everything, and be ready for whatever came next. The security system installation later that day added another layer of protection. Cameras covering every approach to their property, motion sensors that would alert them to any presence in their yard, and improved lighting that left no shadows for anyone to hide in. It was expensive, but the peace of mind was worth every penny. That evening, as Donald reviewed the security footage from the previous night one more time, preparing copies for his records, he realized that their conflict with Cooper had entered a new phase. It was no longer just about Hoa violations and property values, it had become a battle for safety, security, and the right to live without fear in their own home. And while the police might be limited in what they could do now, they had helped establish the groundwork for what might come next. Because Donald was certain of one thing, Cooper wouldn't stop. The police involvement would only fuel his rage, make him more determined to assert his authority. But now they had witnesses, documentation, and official support. Whatever Cooper planned next, they would be ready. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as Dorothy returned from running errands. Beverly and Ben had just finished their last day of school before spring break, and the trunk of her SUV was filled with groceries and supplies for the upcoming week. As she gathered shopping bags from the car, something caught her eye, a crisp white envelope taped to their front door. The Hoa logo embossed in dark blue ink gleaming in the sunlight. Her heart sank. After Donald's visit to the police station 2 days ago, they had hoped Cooper might back off, at least temporarily. The security company had finished installing additional cameras yesterday, and they had begun to feel a tentative sense of safety returning. But that envelope, positioned so prominently on their door, shattered that illusion. Dorothy approached the door slowly, her arms full of groceries. The envelope was placed at eye level, impossible to miss Cooper's preferred method of ensuring his messages had maximum impact. With trembling fingers, she pulled it free, the tape making a sharp sound as it separated from the door's surface. Inside her kitchen, after calling the children in from the car and setting them up with an after-school snack, Dorothy finally allowed herself to open the envelope. The paper inside was heavy, official-looking, with the Hoa letterhead prominently displayed. But it was the content that made her blood run cold. Dear MR and MRS. Barton, it has come to our attention that your property may be in violation of several Hoa guidelines. As a courtesy, I personally inspected your backyard to confirm these potential issues. Please note that refusal to address these violations will result in formal action, including but not limited to fines, liens, or other measures deemed necessary by the board. Your recent installation of unauthorized security equipment presents particular concern. While homeowners are permitted basic security measures, the extensive nature of your system suggests a hostility toward community oversight that cannot be ignored. Additionally, your attempts to involve local law enforcement in Hoa matters are both inappropriate and potentially damaging to community relations. The Hoa board has sole authority over property compliance issues, and external interference will not be tolerated. A comprehensive list of violations will be forthcoming. Immediate compliance is expected. Sincerely, Harold Cooper. Hoa President. Dorothy's hand shook as she read the note again. The implications were clear. Cooper was not only admitting to trespassing but threatening retaliation for their contact with the police. She immediately took photos of the letter with her phone, following the documentation procedures Officer Martinez had recommended. Then she called Donald. He left another note, she said as soon as he answered, her voice tight with anxiety. Donald, he's basically threatening us for going to the police. Read it to me, Donald replied, his voice calm but tense. She could hear him closing his office door in the background, giving their conversation his full attention. As she read the letter aloud, she could almost feel Donald's anger building through the phone. When she finished, there was a moment of heavy silence. I'm calling Officer Martinez, he said finally. This is exactly what she told us to document. Then I'm calling the lawyer we finally got an appointment for next week, but this might move things up. Should I be worried about the children? Dorothy asked, glancing toward the family room where Beverly and Ben were playing. He specifically mentioned the security system, Donald. Like he's offended we're trying to protect ourselves from him. We're doing everything right, Donald assured her, though she could hear the concern in his voice. The cameras are recording, we're documenting everything. He's getting desperate, making mistakes. This letter is proof he's actually admitting to trespassing now. After hanging up, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter. The HOA logo, once a symbol of community standards and property values, now seemed menacing. She remembered their first days in the house, how excited they'd been about joining what seemed like a well-maintained, family-friendly neighborhood. How quickly that dream had turned into a nightmare. The security system chimed, indicating movement at the front of the house. Dorothy tensed until she checked the camera feed on her phone and saw it was just Sarah Mitchell walking her dog. She watched as Sarah slowed near their house, her eyes finding the security cameras. There was a sadness in her expression, a knowledge of what those cameras represented. Dorothy opened the front door. Sarah? Would you like to come in for coffee? Sarah hesitated, glancing up and down the street before nodding. Inside, after the children had been sent upstairs to play, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. I saw Cooper putting something on your door earlier, she said quietly. I wanted to check on you, but... She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Everyone in the neighborhood was afraid of being seen showing support to the Bartons. Dorothy showed her the letter. Sarah's face grew increasingly troubled as she read. This is worse than what he did to the Hendersons, she said, referring to a family that had moved away 6 months ago. He's usually more careful about putting things in writing. The Hendersons, what exactly happened to them? Dorothy asked. They'd heard rumors, but no one seemed to know the full story. Sarah glanced toward the windows before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. They challenged Cooper's authority too. Started with small things, a basketball hoop, like your situation. Then they questioned some financial decisions at a board meeting. Within 3 months, they were drowning in fines, their children were being harassed at the community pool, and strange cars were parking outside their house at all hours. Strange cars? Cooper's associates from the board. They would just sit there, watching the house. When Mrs. Henderson called the police, they claimed they were conducting legitimate HOA business. Sarah's hands tightened around her mug. They sold the house at a loss just to get away. Dorothy felt her chill despite the warm spring afternoon. Why doesn't anyone stop him? There must be ways to remove him from the board. Fear, Sarah replied simply. He's been president for 8 years. He knows everyone's secrets, every minor violation he's overlooked in exchange for loyalty. Plus, he has connections with local officials, or at least, he claims he does. Most people find it easier to just comply. The security system chimed again. Both women jumped, then laughed nervously at their reaction. It was just the mailman. We're not going to run, Dorothy said firmly, surprising herself with her conviction. This is our home. We've done nothing wrong. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I know. And more people support you than you realize. We're just careful about showing it. After Sarah left, Dorothy began preparing dinner, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for the children. But her mind kept returning to the letter, to its barely veiled threats and implications. She found herself checking the security camera feeds more frequently, starting at small noises, watching the street through the windows. When Donald arrived home, they waited until the children were occupied with homework before discussing their next steps. The letter lay between them on the kitchen table like a poisonous thing. "Officer Martinez wants us to file another report," Donald explained. "She says this letter shows an escalation in his behavior. The explicit admission of trespassing, the threats about involving police, it all helps build our case." "Case for what?" Dorothy asked. "What's our end game here, Donald? We can't live like this indefinitely." Donald reached across the table, taking her hand. "The lawyer thinks we have grounds for a harassment suit, possibly even a restraining order. Cooper's getting sloppy, leaving evidence like this letter. He's used to people backing down, running away. Our standing firm is making him desperate." Dorothy squeezed his hand. "I'm not afraid of him," she said, then corrected herself. "No, that's not true. I am afraid. But I'm more afraid of what happens if we let him win, if we teach our children that bullies get their way if they're scary enough." That evening, as they sat on their back patio watching Beverly and Ben play in the yard, they discussed how to handle the situation with the children. The kids had picked up on the tension, noticed the new security cameras, sensed their parents' anxiety. "We need to make them feel safe," Dorothy said, without hiding the reality of what's happening. "They're old enough to understand that sometimes adults behave badly, that standing up to bullies isn't just something that happens on the playground." Donald nodded, watching as Ben showed Beverly a caterpillar he'd found in the garden. "We'll protect them," he said. "And we'll show them how to protect themselves, not by running away, but by standing firm, documenting everything, using the system properly." Later that night, after checking all the doors and cameras one final time, they lay in bed discussing their next moves. The letter had been added to their growing file of evidence, copies made and stored both digitally and in a safe deposit box off-site. They had learned from others' experiences with Cooper. Documentation was their best weapon. "He'll try something else," Dorothy said into the darkness. "This letter, it's like he's testing us, seeing if we'll break." "Let him try," Donald replied, his voice firm. "Every move he makes now just adds to our case against him. He's used to operating in shadows, using implications and threats. But we're shining a light on everything he does, and eventually, he'll have nowhere to hide." The security system hummed quietly, its cameras watching over their home as they drifted off to sleep. Outside, the street was quiet, but they knew Cooper was out there, probably planning his next move. The threatening note had marked another escalation in their conflict, but it had also given them something concrete to fight back with. The question was, what would Cooper do next, now that his usual tactics of intimidation had failed to drive them away? The morning had started like any other. Donald left for work early, preparing for an important client presentation that couldn't be rescheduled despite the growing tension at home. Dorothy maintained their usual routine, finding comfort in the familiarity of making breakfast, checking the children's homework, and organizing the day ahead. The security cameras had shown nothing unusual overnight, and the morning sun painted their neighborhood in deceptively peaceful hues. Beverly and Ben were at school, their couple having picked them up promptly at 7:45 a.m. Dorothy had spent the morning catching up on household tasks, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had become their daily reality. The washing machine hummed in the background as she folded laundry in the living room, its steady rhythm almost meditative. The first knock came at 12:15 p.m. Dorothy froze, the half-folded shirt still in her hands. Through the frosted glass panels flanking their front door, she could make out a familiar silhouette, Harold Cooper's stocky frame, clipboard in hand. Her heart began to race as she remembered Donald's warnings never to engage with Cooper alone. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "MRS. Barton." Cooper's voice carried through the door, its usual bureaucratic tone tinged with something darker. "I know you're in there. Open up." Dorothy remained silent, reaching for her phone. The security cameras showed Cooper standing on their porch, his posture rigid with barely contained anger. She began typing a message to Donald when Cooper's voice cut through the air again. "This is official HOA business, Mrs. Barton. Your continued defiance of community standards cannot be ignored. The doorknob rattled as he tested it, finding it locked. I need access to your backyard. Now. Dorothy's fingers trembled as she completed her text to Donald. Cooper here. Demanding entry. What do I do? Don't let him in, came Donald's immediate response. Call 911 if he won't leave. I'm on my way. Cooper's knocking had become pounding, the door shuddering in its frame. MRS. Barton, his voice had lost all pretense of professionalism. Your family's obstruction ends today. Open this door. Dorothy backed away from the entrance, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Through the glass, she could see Cooper's face, distorted by the frosted pattern but clearly contorted with rage. This wasn't the calculating Hoa president they'd dealt with before. This was something else entirely. Mr. Cooper, she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. Donald isn't home. If you have Hoa business, please send it in writing or wait until he returns. Cooper's laugh was sharp and bitter. Of course. Hide behind your husband. That's what all of you do, hide behind lawyers and police reports and security cameras. But I'm done playing games. There are violations that need to be addressed, and they'll be addressed today. Dorothy watched in horror as Cooper moved to the side of the house, heading toward their backyard gate. The security app on her phone showed him testing the latch, then reaching into his pocket for something. Her breath caught as she realized he was trying to force the gate open. Without hesitation, she dialed 911. Emergency services. What's your situation? There's a man trying to break into my home, Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper as she moved upstairs. Harold Cooper, our Hoa president. He's trying to force entry through our back gate. My husband isn't home, and I'm alone. Stay on the line with me, Mom. Officers are being dispatched. Are all your doors and windows secured? Dorothy did a quick mental inventory. Yes, everything's locked, but he's becoming more aggressive. He was just at the front door, now he's trying to get into the backyard. We have security cameras recording everything. Through the upstairs window, she could see Cooper had managed to open the gate. He strode into their backyard with the confidence of someone who believed they had absolute authority, pulling something from his jacket, a crowbar that glinted dully in the midday sunday. He has a crowbar, Dorothy reported to the dispatcher, her voice shaking. He's in our backyard now. Please hurry, officers are 4 minutes out, the dispatcher assured her. Stay away from windows and doors. Find a secure room if possible. Dorothy retreated to the master bedroom, her mind racing. Cooper had always been aggressive in his enforcement of Hoa rules, but this was different. The man in their backyard wasn't just an overzealous Hoa president, he was someone who had completely lost touch with reality. The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet of the house. He's breaking in, Dorothy whispered urgently into the phone. He's breaking the back door. Officers are almost there, the dispatcher said firmly. Stay hidden. Do not confront him. Dorothy could hear Cooper's footsteps downstairs, accompanied by the sound of items being knocked over. His voice carried up the stairs, filled with a manic energy that made her blood run cold. You think you can just ignore the rules? He shouted. Think you're above the community standards? This is what happens when people like you move in, you ruin everything. The security system was blaring its alarm, but Cooper seemed beyond caring about such deterrence. Dorothy heard him moving through the first floor, opening doors, presumably searching for her. She sent another quick text to Donald. He's inside. Police coming. I'm hidden upstairs, 2 minutes away. Donald replied instantly. Police almost there. Stay safe. Love you. Cooper's footsteps were on the stairs now, heavy and deliberate. MRS. Barton, he called out, his voice almost sing-song. We need to discuss your violations. Your family's continued disrespect for authority cannot go unchallenged. Dorothy pressed herself against the wall of their walk-in closet, trying to control her breathing. Through the phone, she could hear the dispatcher coordinating with approaching officers, providing them with updates on the situation. The Roses, Cooper continued, his voice closer now. The unapproved security cameras. The children's toys left in the yard. Did you think the rules didn't apply to you? Did you think you could just ignore my authority? The handle of the bedroom door rattled. Dorothy held her breath, praying the police would arrive in time. Through the closet door, she could hear Cooper moving around the bedroom, his breathing heavy, muttering about regulations and violations. "Found you." Cooper's voice came from right outside the closet. The door handle began to turn. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, multiple vehicles approaching rapidly. Through the closet's small window, Dorothy could see police cars pulling up to their house, officers emerging with weapons drawn. "Police. Exit the house immediately," the command boomed through a megaphone, echoing through the neighborhood. Cooper's footsteps retreated from the closet door. "This isn't over," he snarled, loud enough for Dorothy to hear. "You can't hide behind the police forever." Dorothy stayed hidden, listening as heavy footsteps thundered through the house, both Cooper's retreat and the police officer's entry. She heard shouting, commands being issued, and finally, the sound she'd been waiting for, suspect in custody. When she finally emerged from the closet, escorted by a female officer, she saw the full extent of Cooper's rampage. The back door's glass panel was shattered, pictures had been knocked from walls, and their normally tidy home looked like it had been hit by a whirlwind of rage. Donald arrived just as the police were leading Cooper to a patrol car. The former HOA president was still ranting about violations and authority, his face red with fury, the crowbar now tagged as evidence. Dorothy ran to her husband, finally letting the tears flow as he held her tightly. "Are you okay?" Donald asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine," Dorothy assured him, though her whole body was shaking. "I stayed hidden, just like we planned." The police came in time. Officer Martinez was among the responding officers, her expression grim as she surveyed the damage. "This is exactly what we were worried about," she said, approaching the couple. "His behavior has been escalating, but this is beyond anything we expected. Breaking and entering, attempted assault, criminal threats. He's not walking away from this one." As they gave their statements to the police, neighbors began gathering outside, drawn by the commotion. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the crowd, her face pale with shock. "I heard the alarm," she said, hugging Dorothy. "I called 911 too. I should have known something like this would happen. He's been getting more unstable ever since you stood up to him." The rest of the day passed in a blur of police interviews, evidence collection, and crime scene photography. Donald picked up the children from school, breaking the news to them gently at Sarah's house while the police finished processing their home. Beverly and Ben were scared but relieved to know that their mom was safe and that Mr. Cooper wouldn't be coming back. That evening, as they sat together in their living room, the broken door temporarily secured with a board, Dorothy finally allowed herself to process what had happened. "He really would have hurt me," she said quietly. "If the police hadn't come when they did." Donald pulled her close, their children cuddled against them on the couch. "But they did come," he said firmly. "And now everyone knows exactly who Cooper really is. No more hiding behind HOA authority or community standards. He showed his true colors today." The security cameras continued their silent vigil, now supplemented by regular police patrols of their street. Cooper was in custody, facing multiple felony charges, but his presence still lingered in their home like a shadow. It would take time for the fear to fade, for their sense of security to return. But as they sat together as a family, surrounded by the mess Cooper had left behind but grateful for their safety, they knew they had made the right choice in standing up to him. The escalation to violence had been terrifying, but it had also been the final act in Cooper's reign of terror over their community. The mask of authority had finally slipped completely, revealing the true face of man consumed by power and control. The road ahead would be challenging, repairs to make, legal proceedings to face, trauma to process. But they would face it together, stronger for having survived, determined to help their community heal from the wounds inflicted by a man who had confused authority with power, rules with righteousness, and control with leadership. Donald's tires screeched as he took the corner onto Maple Avenue, his heart pounding in his chest. Dorothy's terrified voice still echoed in his ears from their last phone call. "He's in the house, Donald." He broke in. The 15-minute drive from his office had never felt longer, even as he pushed well beyond the speed limit. His phone's GPS showed 2 police units already at his address, their presence marked by blinking blue icons on the screen. The security app notifications kept coming. Motion detected in the living room, kitchen, upstairs hallway. Cooper was moving through their home like a predator searching for prey. As Donald approached his house, he could see the police cruisers parked haphazardly in the street, their lights painting the neighborhood in alternating red and blue. Officers had established a perimeter, their weapons drawn, focused on the house. The shattered back door was visible from where he parked, glass glittering on the patio like fallen stars. "Sir, you need to stay back," an officer called out as Donald rushed from his car. "We have an active situation. This is my house," Donald interrupted, his voice tight with urgency. "My wife is inside. Dorothy Barton, she's the one who called 911. Officer Martinez emerged from behind one of the cruisers, recognizing him immediately. "Donald, thank God you're here. We've got officers moving in now. Dorothy's hidden upstairs, and we can see Cooper on the security feeds. He's armed with a crowbar and appears increasingly agitated." Donald's blood ran cold at the word armed. The security camera feed on his phone showed Cooper stalking through their home, the crowbar gleaming in his hand as he shouted about violations and authority. The man looked nothing like the composed Hoa president they'd known. His tie was loose, his usually immaculate hair disheveled, his face contorted with rage. Through the front windows, Donald could see Cooper methodically checking rooms, knocking things over in his search. Each crash made Donald flinch, imagining Dorothy's terror as she hid somewhere above. "Let me go in," Donald said, his voice firm despite his racing heart. "He knows me. Maybe I can talk him down." "Absolutely not," Officer Martinez replied. "He's clearly unstable. We have trained negotiators en route." A scream from inside the house cut her off. Donald's blood turned to ice. He knew that sound. It was Dorothy. Without thinking, without waiting for permission, Donald sprinted toward the house. He heard Officer Martinez shouting behind him, but nothing could stop him now. His wife needed him, and every second counted. The front door was unlocked. Cooper hadn't bothered securing it behind him. Donald entered his home, the security alarm still blaring in the background. The living room was a disaster, pictures knocked from walls, furniture overturned, Cooper's rage made manifest in the destruction. "Cooper," Donald shouted, his voice carrying over the alarm. "Leave my family alone." Footsteps thundered overhead. Then Cooper appeared at the top of the stairs, the crowbar raised menacingly. His eyes were wild, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Finally decided to show up, Barton," Cooper sneered, descending the stairs with deliberate slowness. "Come to defend your precious home from the big bad Hoa president." Donald stood his ground, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. "This has gone far enough, Harold. The police are outside. There's no way this ends well for you." Cooper laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed through the house. "Ends well. It ended the moment you people moved in. You and your family, thinking you could just ignore the rules, challenge my authority. I built this community. I maintained standards. Then you came along with your complaints and your police reports. We followed every reasonable rule," Donald countered, trying to keep Cooper talking while he listened for any sound from upstairs. "You're the one who turned this into a personal vendetta." "Reasonable?" Cooper's voice rose to a shout. "I decide what's reasonable. Me. Not you, not the police, not anyone else in this pathetic neighborhood too weak to maintain standards." He reached the bottom of the stairs, the crowbar tapping against each step as he descended. Donald could smell alcohol on his breath, another sign of how far the formerly rigid Hoa president had fallen. "Think about what you're doing, Harold," Donald said, slowly shifting to keep himself between Cooper and the stairs. "Breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon. You're looking at serious prison time." "Prison?" Cooper laughed again, swinging the crowbar in a casual arc that made Donald step back. "You still don't understand, do you? This is my community. My rules. The police, the courts, they don't understand what it takes to maintain standards. Sometimes you have to take direct action." A floorboard creaked upstairs, and Cooper's head snapped toward the sound. Donald saw the moment Cooper's attention shifted, saw him start to turn back toward the stairs, and knew he had to act. "Your rules don't give you the right to terrorize people," Donald said loudly, drawing Cooper's focus back to him. You're not maintaining standards, you're just a bully with a clipboard who finally snapped. Cooper's face contorted with rage. A bully? I protected this neighborhood. I kept the riffraff out, maintained property values, enforced the standards that make this community what it is. You mean what it was, Donald corrected, his own anger finally surfacing. Before you turned it into a prison where people are afraid to let their kids play outside. Where neighbors are afraid to talk to each other. Where an Hoa president thinks he has the right to break into homes and threaten families. With a roar of fury, Cooper charged forward, the crowbar raised high. Donald had been expecting this, had been provoking it deliberately to keep Cooper's attention away from Dorothy. He dodged the first wild swing, the crowbar smashing into the wall behind him with enough force to punch through the drywall. Donald backed up, trying to maintain distance while keeping Cooper's focus. Is this how you handle all your Hoa business, Harold? Violence when people don't bow to your authority? Shut up. Cooper swung again, his movements becoming more erratic. You don't understand. None of you understand. The rules exist for a reason. The next swing came closer, forcing Donald to jump back against the living room wall. He could hear movement outside, the police preparing to enter, but knew he had to keep Cooper occupied for just a few more moments. The rules exist to serve the community, Donald said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Not to give you power over people's lives. Cooper's next swing was wild, uncontrolled. The crowbar caught the edge of a bookshelf, sending books cascading to the floor. The momentary distraction was all Donald needed. He lunged forward, grabbing Cooper's arm as it completed its arc. They grappled for control of the crowbar, crashing into furniture as they struggled. Cooper might have had the weapon, but years of rage and perceived authority had left him soft. Donald's desperate need to protect his family gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. The sound of breaking glass at the front and back of the house announced the police entry. Police. Drop the weapon. Cooper's grip on the crowbar loosened for just a moment. Surprise, perhaps, or resignation. Donald wrenched it from his hands, throwing it aside just as officers swarmed into the room, weapons drawn. On the ground. Hands where we can see them. Cooper stood there, his chest heaving, staring at Donald with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. For a moment, Donald thought he might try to fight the officers too. Then, slowly, the fight seemed to drain out of him. He sank to his knees, hands raised in surrender. As officers moved in to handcuff Cooper, Donald heard footsteps on the stairs. Dorothy emerged from her hiding place, shaking but unharmed. He rushed to her, pulling her into his arms, feeling her tears soaking into his shirt. I heard everything, she whispered. I was so scared he was going to kill you. I'm okay, Donald assured her, holding her tightly. We're both okay. It's over. They watched as officers led Cooper out of their home. The former Hoa president walked with his head down, the authority he'd wielded like a weapon finally stripped away. Outside, neighbors had gathered, watching in shocked silence as the man who had terrorized their community for years was placed in the back of a police car. Officer Martinez approached them, her expression both relieved and concerned. That was incredibly reckless, she said to Donald, though her tone held more respect than rebuke. But I understand why you did it. We'll need statements from both of you, but that can wait until tomorrow. Right now, focus on taking care of each other. As the police began processing the scene, Donald and Dorothy sat on their front porch, watching the activity around them. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving them both shaky and exhausted. What made him snap like this? Dorothy wondered aloud. How does someone go from being overzealous about rules to this? Donald shook his head, his arm tight around her shoulders. Power corrupts, he said simply. He stopped seeing himself as serving the community and started seeing the community as serving him. When we challenged that illusion, he couldn't handle losing control, Dorothy finished. She looked at their damaged home, then at the neighbors still gathered on the street. Some were crying, others hugging, all processing the end of Cooper's reign of terror in their own ways. We'll need to repair everything, Donald said, surveying the damage. The door, the walls, the furniture, the neighborhood too, Dorothy added softly. There's a lot of healing that needs to happen here. People have been afraid for so long. Donald nodded, understanding that the physical damage to their home was just the beginning. Cooper's actions had left deeper wounds in the community, trust broken, relationships strained, a sense of security shattered. But as he looked at the neighbors gradually coming closer, offering help and support now that the threat was gone, he saw hope too. The confrontation had been violent, frightening, and necessary. It had forced the community to face the monster they'd allowed to grow in their midst. Now, with Cooper gone, they could begin the process of rebuilding not just homes and structures, but the bonds of community that had been strained for so long under his tyrannical rule. The red and blue lights of police vehicles continued to pulse through the gathering dusk, casting alternating shadows across the faces of shocked neighbors who had gathered on the street. The sound of breaking glass had long since faded, replaced by the efficient movements of crime scene technicians and the murmur of dozens of conversations as the community tried to process what had just happened in their supposedly peaceful neighborhood. Donald and Dorothy sat wrapped in emergency blankets on the back of an ambulance, more for shock than any physical injuries. The paramedics had insisted on checking them both over, despite their protests that they were physically unharmed. Beverly and Ben were safe at Sarah Mitchell's house, where they had been quickly taken when the situation began to unfold. Officer Martinez stood nearby, coordinating with other law enforcement personnel while keeping a protective eye on the Bartons. The scene around their house had transformed into something that looked more like a movie set than their quiet suburban street. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off their property, evidence markers dotted the yard where Cooper had dropped various items during his rampage, and photographers documented everything from the broken back door to the damage inside. Mr. and Mrs. Barton, a detective, approached them, his notebook already open. "I'm Detective Wilson from Violent Crimes. I know you've been through a lot, but we need to get your preliminary statements while everything's still fresh." Dorothy gripped Donald's hand tighter as they began recounting the events, the escalating harassment, the threatening note, and finally, today's violent culmination. The detective's pen moved steadily across the pages as they spoke, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. "And you have documentation of the previous incidents?" he asked, looking up from his notes. Donald nodded wearily. "Everything. Security footage, photographs, violation notices, witness statements from neighbors. We've been building a case for weeks. That'll help with prosecution," the detective assured them. "From what we can tell, Mr. Cooper is looking at multiple felony charges, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, criminal threats, stalking." The DA's going to have a field day with this one. As they finished giving their statements, Sarah Mitchell approached with Beverly and Ben in tow. The children ran to their parents, throwing themselves into their arms with a force that nearly knocked Donald and Dorothy off the ambulance step. "Daddy," Ben cried, his face buried in Donald's shirt. "Mrs. Mitchell said there was a bad man in our house. Is he gone?" Beverly asked, her voice small and frightened. "Is Mr. Cooper going to come back?" Dorothy pulled them both close, meeting Donald's eyes over their heads. "How do you explain something like this to children? How do you help them feel safe again in their own home?" "Mr. Cooper did a very bad thing," Donald began carefully, choosing his words with deliberate precision. "But the police have him now, and he won't be able to hurt anyone anymore. Sometimes adults make terrible choices, and when they do, they have to face the consequences. Like when we break the rules and get time out," Ben asked, trying to understand in terms he could grasp. "Something like that," Dorothy said, managing a small smile. "But Mr. Cooper broke very serious rules, so his punishment will be much more severe than a timeout." As they comforted their children, neighbors began approaching tentatively, offering support and assistance. Mrs. Anderson from 2 doors down brought over containers of hot soup and fresh bread. The Pattles offered their guest room if the Bartons needed a place to stay while their home was being processed as a crime scene. Even people they barely knew came forward with offers of help, as if Cooper's arrest had broken some spell of fear that had held the community in its grip. "We should have done something sooner," Mr. Jenkins, the retired teacher from across the street, said quietly to Donald. "We all knew Cooper was out of control, but we were too afraid to stand up to him. You and your family, you showed us what courage looks like." The crime scene technicians worked efficiently, documenting and collecting evidence. Each flash of their cameras illuminated another aspect of Cooper's destruction: the splintered door frame, the holes punched in walls, the scattered remnants of family photos whose frames had been smashed in his rage. Officer Martinez approached with news about Cooper. "He's being processed at the station," she informed them. "No bail, at least initially." Given the violent nature of the attack and his position of authority in the community, the judge agreed he poses a significant flight risk and danger to others. "What happens now?" Dorothy asked, her arms still protectively around their children. "Now you focus on healing," Martinez replied kindly. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to make formal statements, and you'll want to speak with the DA's office. They'll be handling the prosecution. But tonight, you need rest and time to process." As the evening wore on, the police presence began to diminish. The crime scene unit finished their work, the last photographs were taken, and the evidence was carefully catalogued and removed. The neighbors gradually dispersed, though not before organizing a schedule to help the Bartons with everything from meals to cleanup over the coming days. The Bartons had accepted the Pattles' offer of their guest room for the night, not wanting the children to sleep in a house that still bore such fresh wounds from violence. As they packed overnight bags, Donald and Dorothy moved through their home in a daze, the full impact of what had happened still sinking in. "Look at this," Dorothy said softly, picking up a framed photo of their family that had somehow survived Cooper's rampage unscathed. It showed all four of them at the beach last summer, laughing and happy, no hint of the nightmare that would enter their lives when they moved to Oak Ridge Estates. "We'll get back there," Donald promised, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We're safe now. Cooper can't hurt us anymore." The children were unusually quiet as they prepared for bed in the Pattles' guest room. Beverly had insisted on bringing her entire collection of stuffed animals, creating a protective barrier around herself and Ben. Dorothy sat with them until they finally fell into an exhausted sleep, their small faces still showing traces of the day's fear even in slumber. In the Pattles' kitchen, Donald and Dorothy sat with their hosts, cups of tea growing cold as they discussed the events that had led to this point. The whole neighborhood knew something like this would happen eventually, M.R. Patel said, shaking his head. Cooper had been getting more aggressive, more controlling, for years. But none of us expected him to snap like this. He couldn't handle losing control, Mrs. Patel added. When your family stood up to him, showed others it was possible to resist. I think it broke something in him that was already cracking. Donald stared into his tea, remembering the wild look in Cooper's eyes during their confrontation. He really believed he owned this community, he said quietly. That his position gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. Power corrupts, Mr. Patel nodded sagely. And Cooper had been drunk on his little bit of power for far too long. Later that night, lying in the Pattles' guest room with their children sleeping between them, Donald and Dorothy spoke in whispers about the future. Should we move? Dorothy asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her. Find somewhere else to start over. Donald was quiet for a moment, considering. I don't think so, he finally replied. If we leave, Cooper wins in a way. Besides, did you see how the neighborhood came together tonight? For the first time since we moved here, it felt like a real community. Dorothy reached across their sleeping children to take his hand. You're right. Running away won't help us heal. And the kids need to see that we don't let fear drive us from our home. Outside, the street was quiet now, the police lights long gone. But the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Cooper's reign of terror had ended in violence, but from that violence, something new was emerging, a community ready to rebuild, to heal, to become what it should have been all along. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, formal statements to make, legal proceedings to begin, damage to repair. But tonight, surrounded by the love of their children and the support of their neighbors, the Bartons could finally begin to breathe again. The immediate aftermath of trauma was still raw, but beneath it lay the foundation for recovery and renewal, not just for their family, but for the entire community that had lived too long under Cooper's shadow. The county courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky, its classical architecture a reminder of the weight and solemnity of legal proceedings. Donald and Dorothy Barton climbed the worn stone steps, their footsteps echoing in the early morning quiet. It had been 3 weeks since Cooper's violent break-in, and today marked the beginning of the legal proceedings that would determine his fate. Detective Wilson met them in the courthouse lobby, his familiar presence offering some comfort in the intimidating surroundings. "The DA wants to meet with you before the preliminary hearing," he explained, leading them through security. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, they're pursuing maximum charges." The district attorney's office was a maze of cubicles and conference rooms, bustling with activity even at this early hour. Amanda Chen, the assistant district attorney assigned to their case, greeted them with firm handshakes and ushered them into her office. "I've reviewed all the evidence," she began, spreading files across her desk. "The security footage, the documentation of prior harassment, witness statements from neighbors, it's compelling. Cooper's actions show a clear pattern of escalating behavior that culminated in violent criminal acts." Dorothy leaned forward, her hand finding Donald's. "What exactly is he being charged with?" Chen consulted her notes. "We're looking at multiple felony counts, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, criminal threats, stalking, attempted assault, and abuse of authority. Given his position as HOA president and the premeditated nature of his actions, we're pushing for enhanced sentencing." "What kind of sentence are we talking about?" Donald asked. "If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 15 to 20 years, Chen replied. "The abuse of authority charge is particularly significant. We want to send a message that using a position of community trust to terrorize residents won't be tolerated." As they discussed the case, Chen revealed that other victims had come forward since Cooper's arrest. 3 former residents who had been driven from the neighborhood by his harassment had provided statements. The HOA's financial records, now under investigation, showed irregularities that suggested Cooper had been using community funds for personal expenses. "The problem," Chen explained, "is that Cooper's attorney is trying to paint this as a simple dispute over HOA regulations that got out of hand. They're going to argue that his actions, while perhaps overzealous, were motivated by a genuine desire to maintain community standards." "Overzealous?" Dorothy's voice shook with barely contained anger. "He broke into our home with a crowbar. He terrorized our children. He made us afraid to live in our own house." Chen nodded sympathetically. "Which is exactly why your testimony is crucial. The jury needs to understand that this wasn't about property values or community guidelines. It was about power, control, and systematic harassment that escalated to violence." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. As they entered the courtroom, Donald and Dorothy saw Cooper for the first time since his arrest. He sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his usually immaculate appearance now disheveled. The former HOA president looked smaller somehow, his authority stripped away by circumstances of his own making. Cooper's eyes met theirs briefly as they took their seats. There was still anger there, but something else too, a hint of desperation, perhaps, or the first glimmers of understanding about the consequences of his actions. The hearing proceeded with formal efficiency. The prosecution presented their evidence, security footage of Cooper's break-in, photographs of the damage he'd caused, medical reports documenting Dorothy's anxiety and the children's trauma. Detective Wilson testified about the investigation, describing the pattern of harassment they'd uncovered. Cooper's defense attorney tried to minimize his client's actions, suggesting that the Bartons had provoked the incident by repeatedly violating HOA guidelines. But the evidence was overwhelming. When the security footage played, showing Cooper rampaging through their home with a crowbar while searching for Dorothy, several jurors visibly recoiled. During a break-in proceedings, Sarah Mitchell approached them in the courthouse hallway. She had been subpoenaed to testify about Cooper's history of harassment in the neighborhood. "The whole community is watching this case," she told them quietly. "People are finally talking about everything they endured under Cooper's leadership. It's like a dam breaking, all these stories coming out now that people aren't afraid anymore." The preliminary hearing lasted 3 days. Other residents testified about their experiences with Cooper: arbitrary fines, constant surveillance, threats of liens and foreclosure. The HOA's financial records revealed years of mismanagement and personal enrichment at the community's expense. On the final day, Cooper's attorney approached the prosecution with a plea offer. Chen called the Bartons into a conference room to discuss it. He's willing to plead guilty to reduce charges, she explained. 10 years with possibility of parole after 7, plus restitution for damages and permanent restraining orders protecting not just your family but the entire community. Donald and Dorothy exchanged looks. What do you think we should do? Dorothy asked. Chen laid out the pros and cons. A trial would likely result in a longer sentence, but it would also mean putting your family through months of proceedings, testimony, and cross-examination. The plea deal gives us a guaranteed outcome and immediate resolution, after careful consideration and discussions with their children, who were still struggling with nightmares about the mean man coming back. The Bartons agreed to the plea deal. The certainty of knowing Cooper would be imprisoned and legally barred from ever returning to their community outweighed the desire for a longer sentence. The sentencing hearing was held the following week. The courtroom was packed with Oak Ridge Estates residents, all there to witness the final chapter of Cooper's reign of terror. When given the opportunity to address the court, Cooper's statement revealed much about the mindset that had led to his actions. "I only wanted to maintain standards," he said, his voice lacking its former authority. The community needed strong leadership, rules, order. Without that, everything falls apart. Even now, he seemed unable to fully grasp the impact of his actions on the people he had terrorized. Judge Harrison wasn't swayed by Cooper's attempts at justification. "Mr. Cooper," she began, her voice stern, "you were entrusted with a position of authority in your community. Instead of using that position to serve your neighbors, you used it to harass, intimidate, and ultimately commit violent crimes against the very people you were supposed to protect." The judge's words carried through the silent courtroom as she continued. "Your actions demonstrate not just a criminal mindset, but a fundamental misunderstanding of leadership and community. Rules exist to serve people, not to control them. Authority is granted by the community, not seized through fear and intimidation." The sentence was delivered, 10 years in state prison, with possibility of parole after 7 years. Additional conditions included financial restitution to the Bartons and the Hoa, permanent restraining orders, and a prohibition on ever serving in any community leadership position again. As Cooper was led away in handcuffs, Dorothy felt tears running down her face, not of sadness or fear, but of relief. The nightmare that had consumed their lives for months was finally, officially over. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered around the Bartons, offering support and sharing their own feelings about the resolution. Many expressed guilt about not standing up to Cooper sooner, while others spoke of their hopes for rebuilding the community without his toxic influence. "What happens now?" someone asked. "The Hoa still exists. We still need leadership." Donald addressed the group, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "Now we build the kind of community we always should have had. One based on mutual respect, genuine cooperation, and understanding that rules exist to help us live together, not to control each other." The legal resolution had done more than just punish Cooper. It had created an opportunity for healing and transformation. As they drove home from the courthouse, Donald and Dorothy discussed the future. "It's strange," Dorothy mused, "but in a way, Cooper's actions ended up bringing the community together more than his rules ever did." Donald nodded, thinking about the changes they'd already seen. Neighbors talking openly again, children playing freely in their yards, a new sense of shared purpose in rebuilding their community's trust and spirit. That evening, as they sat on their front porch watching Beverly and Ben play with neighborhood children, they could feel the difference in the air. The fear that had hung over Oak Ridge Estates was gone, replaced by something new: hope, possibility, and the promise of a community finally free to become what it was always meant to be. The legal resolution had provided more than just justice. It had given them all a fresh start, a chance to rebuild not just their homes and their community, but their faith in the power of standing up against tyranny, no matter how small or local it might seem. Cooper's sentence marked the end of one chapter in their lives, but more importantly, it marked the beginning of another, filled with the potential for genuine community, mutual support, and the kind of neighborhood they had dreamed of when they first moved to Oak Ridge Estates. 6 months after Harold Cooper's sentencing, Oak Ridge Estates was transforming into the community it had always promised to be. The changes were both subtle and profound. Children's laughter echoed through streets that had once been eerily quiet, neighbors chatted freely across fences without fear of violations, and gardens bloomed with varieties that would have never passed Cooper's strict approved plant list. The Bartons' home, once the site of violence and fear, had become a symbol of resilience and renewal. The damaged walls had been repaired, the broken door replaced, and Dorothy's garden had exploded into a riot of colors that brought joy to everyone who passed by. But the most significant changes weren't physical, they were in the way the community had come together, healing not just from Cooper's reign of terror, but from years of isolation and fear. On a warm Saturday morning, Donald stood in his driveway, watching as neighbors gathered for the first ever Oak Ridge Estates Community Day. The event had been Beverly's idea, born from a simple question: Dad, now that the mean man is gone, can we have a block party? That simple question had grown into something bigger. Tables lined the street, loaded with potluck dishes that represented the diversity of their community. The Pattles had brought samosas, the Rodriguez's contributed homemade tacos, and Mrs. Anderson's famous apple pie sat next to Sarah Mitchell's chocolate cake. Children darted between the tables, their faces painted with butterflies and superhero masks by one of the teenage residents who had volunteered her artistic skills. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Dorothy said, coming to stand beside him. She was wearing a name tag that read Community Council Member, one of many changes that had come to Oak Ridge Estates in the wake of Cooper's departure. The HOA still existed, but it had been completely restructured. Gone was the autocratic presidency that had given Cooper his power. In its place was a community council, elected by residents and operating with transparency and accountability. Rules still existed, but they were now focused on genuine community needs rather than control. "Remember how scared everyone was to even talk to each other?" Donald mused, watching as Sarah Mitchell organized a group of children for a scavenger hunt. Now look at this. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first community meeting after Cooper's sentencing had been tense, filled with guilt, anger, and fear. Many residents blamed themselves for allowing his behavior to continue for so long. Others were afraid that any new leadership would eventually become just as corrupt. But healing had come gradually, through small acts of kindness and deliberate efforts to rebuild trust. The Bartons had played a crucial role, sharing their story openly and helping others understand that standing up to bullies, even those with official authority, was not just right but necessary. Beverly and Ben ran past, carrying water balloons for the games that had been set up in the park at the end of the street. Their recovery had been its own journey: therapy sessions, nightmares that gradually became less frequent, and the slow return of their natural childhood confidence. Seeing them play freely now, without constantly looking over their shoulders, made every difficult moment worth it. Emma Barton, a voice drew Donald's attention. It was Tommy Chen, one of the teenage residents who had once been too afraid to play basketball in his own driveway because of Cooper's rules. "The historical display is ready. Would you like to see it?" The historical display had been another community healing project, a collection of photographs, documents, and stories that chronicled both the difficult times under Cooper and the community's journey to recovery. It was housed in the clubhouse, where Cooper had once held his intimidating HOA meetings. Donald followed Tommy into the clubhouse, now bright and welcoming after its recent renovation. The display began with Cooper's early days as HOA president, showing how gradually, almost imperceptibly, his authority had grown more oppressive. There were copies of arbitrary violation notices, photographs of the ridiculous measuring devices he'd used to find infractions, and statements from residents about their experiences. But the display didn't end with Cooper's arrest. It continued, showing the community's recovery, the first free neighborhood meeting, children reclaiming the parks and streets, gardens blooming with previously forbidden plants. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of people coming together to overcome fear. "We needed this," Tommy said, gesturing to the display. "To remember what happened, but also to see how far we've come." Outside, the community celebration was in full swing. A local band, formed by residents who had discovered their shared love of music during one of the new monthly community gatherings, played cheerful tunes. The music mixed with laughter, conversation, and the squeals of children playing freely. Sarah Mitchell approached Donald, her eyes bright with tears. "I was just thinking about last year," she said. "How we all lived in our houses like they were fortresses, afraid to step out of line. Now look at us." The contrast was striking. Where Cooper had used rules to divide and control, the community had found ways to use guidelines to support and connect. The new community council met monthly, with open discussions and transparent decision-making. Residents were encouraged to participate, to voice concerns, to suggest improvements. Even the physical appearance of the neighborhood had changed. While properties were still well maintained, there was now room for individual expression. The Rodriguez family had painted their front door a bright yellow, something that would have resulted in multiple violations under Cooper. The Chens had installed a beautiful koi pond, and the Andersons had converted their front yard into a butterfly garden. As the day progressed, Dorothy gathered everyone for a community photograph. Residents crowded together, smiling genuinely, children sitting cross-legged in front, pets included in the frame. It was a far cry from the stiff, formal Hoa meetings of the past. "This is going in the display," Dorothy announced, "to show what a real community looks like." Later, as the sun began to set and residents helped clean up from the celebration, Donald found himself sitting on his front porch with several neighbors. They were sharing stories, not just about Cooper's reign, but about their hopes for the future. "You know what the biggest change is," Mr. Patel observed. "It's not the rules or the management, it's how we see each other. We're not just houses and violations anymore. We're people, families, neighbors." Beverly and Ben had fallen asleep on the porch swing, tired from a day of unrestricted play and community celebration. Dorothy gently covered them with a blanket, remembering how recently they had been too afraid to even play in their own yard. "We should make this an annual event," someone suggested. "Community Day, a reminder of how far we've come and where we're going." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement. Plans were already being made for next year's celebration, with ideas for more activities, more involvement, more ways to strengthen the bonds that had formed from shared adversity. As the last neighbors headed home, their voices carrying cheerful goodnights across lawns that no longer needed to be measured for compliance, Donald and Dorothy sat together on their porch. The security cameras were still there, but they felt less like protection against a threat and more like quiet guardians of their peace. "Do you ever regret standing up to him?" Dorothy asked softly. Given everything that happened, Donald looked at their sleeping children, at the street full of homes where lights glowed warmly and people lived without fear, at the community that had emerged stronger from its darkest time. "Never," he replied. "Sometimes you have to go through the darkness to find the light." Cooper's control was the darkness, but look what came after: real community, real connections, real healing. The stars were coming out, twinkling above a neighborhood that had found its way back to what it was always meant to be. Not a collection of houses bound by rigid rules and fear, but a community of people who had learned the true meaning of being neighbors. Beverly stirred slightly in her sleep, smiling at some pleasant dream. The days of nightmares about the mean man were fading, replaced by memories of scavenger hunts, water balloon fights, and streets full of playing children. The healing wasn't complete. Such things take time, but the foundation was strong. Cooper's attempt to control through fear had ultimately failed, giving way to something much more powerful, a community united by choice, by care, by the shared understanding that true strength comes not from rigid rules but from supporting each other. As Donald and Dorothy carried their sleeping children to bed, the security system's soft green light winked in the darkness. But now it stood watch over a different kind of community, one where safety came from connection rather than control, where rules existed to support rather than suppress, and where the true measure of a neighborhood was not in the height of its grass or the color of its shutters, but in the strength of its bonds and the warmth of its welcome.